مرحبا جميعا، سعداء جدا أن نكون معكم اليوم في أولى جلسات ملتقى أريج 16 الذي يعقد تحت عنوان التعاون عبر الحدود في عالم منقسم. عالم منقسم في ظل ازدواجية المعايير
with the world journalism and the impossible or difficult access in documenting the war crimes that are taking place in Gaza. An investigative journalist and through we have been experiencing many experiments across the Arab world and in Gaza in using a number of tools and methods that would reach out or access and document the war crimes and whatever is taking place, and also revealing what happens on the ground, including all sorts of tools. At first, in this first session, we would have Manisha Gangouri, an investigative journalist specialized in documenting the war crimes through the open source, open resources. She is experienced in the open source. So let's start with a new investigation that would be published on The Guardian within the next 20 minutes, prepared by Manisha, which documents a number of violations against a number of hospitals in Gaza through the open resources. What are the challenges facing Manisha, and how did you work on this investigation?
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, ARIJ, for having me. I apologize for speaking in English. So for the past 1 month, I've been documenting the damage to hospitals, health facilities and ambulances in Gaza over a period of 3 weeks, from 20th of October roughly to the 10th of November, which was the most intense period of bombing that medical facilities and humanitarian organizations saw since the Al-Ali bombing. And part of the reason for that is because hospitals have special protection under international humanitarian law and must not be targets under any circumstances because they house civilians. And then the second reason is because they were also used by civilians who were in no position to evacuate to the southern part of Gaza as shelters. And the World Health Organization put out a very strong statement stating that it was impossible for civilians to evacuate to southern Gaza, A, because there were not enough ambulances for the patients, and B, because even if they did manage to evacuate all patients to southern Gaza, the hospitals didn't have sufficient patient beds. And these patients included premature babies, as you might have seen in Al-Shifa Hospital, where 2 to 4 babies died as a result of intense bombardment. So what we were able to document is that within that 3-week time, nine of the largest hospitals in northern Gaza came under intense bombardment. 5 ambulances that we could confirm were attacked, and 1 health facility which didn't have inpatients but was a rehabilitation center for amputees and disabled people was completely destroyed. Out of the 9 health facilities that we focused on, only 2 facilities are currently still functioning in Gaza. And when I say functioning, they barely have beds, they barely have medication, and they barely have any support. Of the 10 hospitals that I looked at, both the pediatric hospitals, which provide specialized care for children and babies in Gaza, are currently out of service. The only dedicated cancer hospital in Gaza, I can confirm, is out of service. And the only psychiatric hospital which were treating people for PTSD amidst intense Israeli airstrikes is also out of service. Of the attacks that we investigated, we were able to attribute 4 of the attacks to Israeli munitions, just based on the evidence that we could find in terms of munitions fragments and shrapnel. One was the attack on Al-Shifa Hospital, which was quite viral online because an Israeli illumination artillery shell was found and 1 person was seriously injured. That same night, Al-Shifa Hospital's maternity ward was bombed. There were multiple casualties. Again, the tail of an Israeli artillery shell landed inside the hospital premises where multiple civilians, if not hundreds, were sheltering at that time. Alongside that, outside Al-Shifa Hospital, again, a convoy of ambulances was bombed. They were moving to the southern part of Gaza. The Israeli army claimed that these ambulances were being used by Hamas. We were able to look at videos of what was inside the ambulances and the aftermath, and we were able to confirm to the best of our ability, based on the available evidence, that most of the casualties appeared to look like civilians. We were able to look inside 2 of the ambulances. One had a young injured male with a sling, and the other person was a woman in a full hospital gown. The munition fragments found on the site indicated that it was an Israeli Spike NLOS missile. The Israeli army's response to that was that Hamas moves their combatants unarmed in such situations. So waiting to see. Alongside that, we were also able to look at why ambulances weren't able to operate. It's because these airstrikes targeted the roads surrounding the hospitals, cratering them, basically meaning that most of these roads were filled with rubble from nearby collapsed buildings. In at least 1 hospital, there was intense bombardment of the building immediately opposite. At multiple hospitals, at least 5 were enveloped in smoke. Patients inside were terrified and unable to evacuate because there were Israeli tanks nearby. So it seemed like there was no possible safe passage for civilians to leave these hospitals. The Israeli army has claimed that Hamas is using the basement of these hospitals, but prior to this, I investigated the bombing of the Jabalia refugee camp on October 31st. I say October 31st because Jabalia refugee camp was bombed at least 7 times. It was bombed again 30 minutes ago for the 8th time. The attack while I was investigating the attack on October 31st, it was already bombed 2 times during the 24 hours it took me to put the investigation together. But why that's important is because there were 5 massive craters, at least 8 buildings that were completely destroyed. And all of this was because of these Israeli munitions called JDAMs, which have very, very high payload. And the critical part with that investigation was we asked international humanitarian law experts in Europe whether it is allowed to target a civilian target to get back at 1 senior Hamas commander. Is it possible and allowed to kill hundreds of people for that? And the answer we got was twofold. One is that the principles of proportionality are an integral part of international humanitarian law. So you should be able to justify whether it is okay to kill hundreds of people just to hit at 1 senior target. And the second reason is that the main defense that Israel has used is that we have asked civilians to evacuate to the southern border. However, the international law experts told us that civilians who choose not to evacuate to the south of the border are still protected by international humanitarian law and do not lose the privileges and must not be harmed even if they choose not to evacuate.
Thank you. فيما يخص اعتقد معظم الصحفيين الموجودين عندهم نفس السؤال.
It's the same question. What are the methods that have used? And I'm not talking about the legal challenges. I'm talking what other challenges have you faced?
So As most of you are already familiar with the situation, it's been almost 50 days that no foreign journalists have been allowed on the ground in Gaza. Those foreign journalists who have been allowed have been embedded with the IDF in heavily controlled settings where they have not, as you might have seen in Channel 4 report, foreign journalists are not allowed to talk to civilians who are evacuating from northern Gaza. And then the second reason is that over 50 Palestinian journalists have been killed in Gaza since the start of the offensive. Again, journalists, like medical workers, have special privileges under IHL. So both of these things, combined with the telecommunications blackout repeatedly imposed on Gaza by Israel, has created an information black hole. So there's a couple of methods that we used to piece together what was actually happening on the ground. So the two main resources that I thought were really useful was the Al Jazeera and Reuters have two live stream cameras set up at a very high perimeter, which were live streaming at all times and managed to catch multiple instances of bombardment. And the second reason is that pretty much most civilians on the ground who have the opportunity to upload stuff in between the blackouts are doing so. And that we're seeing two things. One is that there is an immense amount of solidarity among the Palestinian journalists who are coordinating to the best of their ability under extreme situations to get the word out. And that the second bit is that there is a lot of knowledge among the civilians who are sheltering in these hospitals. So what they're actually, the reason I was able to confirm these Israeli munitions was because there are multiple people on the site of these various attacks documenting it, showing us the weapons and risking their lives to do so because they understand the value of these kinds of investigations in terms of holding power to account. And the techniques that I used are sort of what you'd call the usual open source techniques, which is the first step is verification. Is what we're seeing real? The reason I say that is because since the start of the war, we've seen a lot of misinformation. A majority of the images that are being used for misinformation on Gaza as Israeli war crimes are actually war crimes committed by Assad and Russia in Syria. So there's a difficulty in separating fact from fiction. So the first step is, can we make sure that this video shows what it claims to, corroborating with international humanitarian organizations like World Health Organization, MSF, and then the usual tools, which is, can we geolocate it to an exact point? This is obviously extremely tricky. In one case, we weren't able to geolocate because there weren't any pictures of the building before. In the case of one, the International Eye Hospital in Gaza, it was hit, from what we understand, a minimum of 2 times, and it doesn't exist. So when I'm looking on satellite imagery, there's just a massive crater from an airstrike where the hospital used to be. Obviously, the interesting thing about this war is that only one side has air power, which means that if I see a massive crater and I'm able to gauge through crater analysis that the weight of the munition used and the size of the crater, I speak to weapons experts, I do my own analysis, and we're able to confirm in several cases that it looks like an Israeli airstrike. Obviously, we are not on the ground, so we cannot ever be 100% certain. And then in other cases, similarly, crater analysis, in one case of the bombing at Al-Shifa Hospital, we actually see the Israeli artillery shell in the air come into the hospital, hit the target, and then we see a video of the civilian who is injured, and then another video of the munition close up. We also do chronolocation to piece together the timeline of events in terms of the severity of the bombardment. This was particularly important for the case of Al-Shifa because it was bombed 3 times within sort of less than 24 hours. So there was one bombing at around 1 a.m. and then a couple hours later, the maternity ward was bombed. And then again, early the next morning, one of the civilian shelters, it's a massive hospital compound, if you're familiar. One of the civilian shelters had a hole in the roof and at least 3 children were injured. And it's part of the difficulty with the chronolocation is that it's relentless. It's not just one attack per day. It's multiple attacks, several hours from each other. And you have to make sure that you don't mix them up because it's very difficult to tell whether the damage that I'm looking at is happened today or it's the damage from last week. The medical organizations on the ground have been really helpful because they're keeping a tally of every single hospital that has been hit.
شكرا جزيلا. قبل الجلسة تحدثنا مطولا عن المعايير المزدوجة في تغطية ما يحدث.
Talking about double standards in Gaza and what was happening compared to what was happening in Ukraine. How can journalists, whether we work in media agencies or live stream, document? Are there journalists just to fact check what's taking place on the ground? So this is what we need to know, really, or through open sources.
I'm glad you mentioned Syria because that was, before Ukraine, the most documented war in human history because everyone had a smartphone with a camera and an internet connection. And it was also the first test of open source reporting by sort of my colleagues at Bellingcat, my colleagues at BBC Arabic. Everyone was testing the techniques, but what was interesting about Syria is that we weren't the only ones testing the techniques. So I'll give you an example. We investigated a Russian double tap attack on a civilian market in Syria in 2019. A double tap attack, if you're not familiar, is one where one strike is followed by another within a span of 30 minutes to an hour. And the reason why this gap is important and why there's double tap is because you're trying to kill the first responders, the doctors and the journalists who arrive on the site. This is absolutely inexcusable for 2 reasons. One is because doctors and journalists are protected under international humanitarian law. So this is a straight out war crime. And the second is that the reason they do this is so that medics and journalists are afraid to cover these incidents and don't offer to help the next time this happens. What was really interesting about these attacks is that they were continuing with impunity across Syria. Russian planes are still bombing Syria. It was happening at the same time as Gaza. It didn't get any coverage because of that. But it's only when the war with Ukraine started that suddenly Russia became the international bad guy. I was working with BBC Russia. I was investigating sort of cluster munition attacks. And the Russian planes are still doing double tap attacks in Ukraine. And that's when it became an international war crime. I'll give you an example. My first investigation of war crimes in Ukraine was the Kramatorsk train station attack with an old Soviet missile called Tochka. It's a cluster munition. Cluster munitions basically are they're a massive bomb filled with tiny little bomblets. And the reason why there is treaty to ban them, they're not a war crime in itself, but some countries have signed up to ban them, is because the weapon is designed to maximize the number of civilian casualties. It took me 24 hours to finish the investigation from start to finish with colleagues on ground. And the reason why is because this exact same weapon had been used in Syria. I think the last one that I looked at was on New Year's Day 2020. So all of the techniques the weapons, the war crimes that you're seeing in Ukraine that are being internationally condemned have been continuing in Syria, and that Syria was the first Russian playground for war crimes. So I think when we're looking at accountability for Russian war crimes, we have to start with Syria, because that is where it all started. That is where we allowed Russia to continue bombing civilians, committing war crimes in broad daylight, and also repeatedly blocking resolutions at the UN Security Council for any accountability.
على المساءلة والمحاسبة، كيف يمكن التحقيقات
accountability regarding the reports that rely on open sources? Would this be a tool that can be switched into illegal accountability as a tool to activate or to move regarding violations, whether in Gaza or elsewhere? And this is what we have witnessed in Ukraine. Whether reports, investigative report that you produced or that you worked on in general, relying on open source, on open resources.
I'm glad you asked that. So I started specializing in war crimes. It also, for me, it started with Libya. In 2017, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for a horrible warlord called Mahmoud al-Warfali, if some of you might be familiar with him. He's part of the Al-Saika Brigade, and the arrest warrant did something unprecedented in international law. It was issued entirely on the basis of videos that he filmed of around 37 executions, and the war crime charge was for murder. And that sort of showed two things. One is that the ICC is willing to issue arrest warrants and prosecute on the basis of open source, which means that any open source investigations we do can be used to prosecute and hold accountable those in power. And the second is that it is really, really important to preserve the open source evidence. In the case of the Rohingya refugee crisis and in Syria, we saw social media platforms working overtime to moderate it. In some cases, evidence of war crimes was just deleted as graphic content, which massively hampered the investigative efforts of international lawyers and for journalists. But I think now, especially because, we saw open source in practice in Syria, it became sort of more widely known in Ukraine. I think there is definitely an understanding among the international community that you can do that. In fact, investigations that I've worked on have been cited at the UN Security Council, has been used to impose sanctions by the EU, has been acted on to impose sanctions by the US government, and all of these were war crimes investigations that I worked on.
لكن هذا لن يحدث ويمكن لن يحدث فيما يخص الانتهاكات اللي تحصل في غزة. لدينا 9 دقائق للحاضرين في القاعة إذا لديكم أي أسئلة.
The audience, if you have any questions, and for our colleagues on Zoom, if you have any questions, please write them.
الإجابة عنها. إذا في حدا عنده أي سؤال من القاعة، أو ممكن إنه ننتقل للسؤال الأخير أو مجموعة من النصائح اللي ممكن تقدميها للصحفيين الاستقصائيين للعمل على هكذا نوع من التحقيقات.
I think there's a question inside.
Okay.
صباح الخير، اسمي شيماء، أنا متخصصة في البيس جورناليزم، فلهذا السبب أنا مهتمة أعرف من منيشة إذا هي عندها نصائح. مثلا دائما الريبورتنج على البيس أو التقارير الساعية للسلام بشكل ما في مناطق الحروب والنزاعات هي دائما الأصعب. فإذا هي عندها نوع من النصائح أو اتجاهات معينة ممكن الصحفي اللوكال جورناليست أو الانترناشونال ممكن يتبعها، مثلا إن هو يعني ليس فقط reporting على الأسلحة أو على الأشياء اللي تؤجج الصراع. فإذا في نصائح باستخدام المصادر المفتوحة فأنا أحب أسمع يعني. شكراً.
Thank you so much for the question. A couple of things. One is the reason why we report on the weapons is because these weapons are being made by specific companies who are making profits. We're seeing that with Gaza right now. We have two massive American companies which issued record profits because of the war in Gaza. And then the second reason is that these arms are being sold by specific companies to these offending companies. So part of that reason is to hold that to account. In terms of local journalists, I think the open source journalism, the evidence is important to hold people accountable. But the reason why we do this is for the survivors. We do it for the civilians. We do it for the people without power who cannot speak for themselves. So there is no point in doing the best investigation of your life if you cannot elevate the voices of the people who have survived these attacks. We do these investigations to prevent these attacks from happening again in future. So part of that is in seeking the peace that you're talking about, and part of that is in showing that, one, that war is hell and it needs to stop, and second, the casualties in every war, no matter who wins, is always the civilians, it's always the children, it's always the people who are scarred forever by this, and that's who we're trying to protect by reporting on this. In terms of advice, I'll focus on local journalists because I feel like international journalists have enough support already. When I did my PhD in sort of looking at open source investigative journalism and how it was sort of changing newsrooms, and the two areas that I try to focus on is gender, because women are massively underrepresented in any kind of investigative reporting, let alone war reporting. In most cases, the risk assessment for women is higher because the risks we take are higher, but actually the journalism that we produce is more nuanced. Women reporting on war focus more on the civilians, it's more empathetic, and it's less about who is fighting whom, it's more about the casualty and the impact on the real people. And then the second bit that I looked at was trauma. In most war zones throughout history, we have always had a battalion of white male international journalists who would parachute into a war zone, report on it, and then leave. And the people who actually are the most traumatized by this war reporting are actually the local journalists, the people that most international organizations like to call fixers, but who are actually the journalists who are experts in that region. And what I found is two things. One is that when you're doing open source investigative reporting, so my technique with any single attack is that I have to watch it over and over and over again. It's 10, 50 times, which means that if there are multiple casualties, I'm watching about 20 people die repeatedly every day, 8 hours a day. And if you're if you're Syrian and you're reporting on Syria, you're hearing people screaming at the end of their lives over and over again. And to you, because you understand the accent, the dialect, the language, it sounds like your family. You're connecting to it more emotionally, which means that you're more likely to get traumatized. However, it does not mean that you are weaker. There is an international perception, mostly among men reporting on war, that showing emotion, that expressing it makes you weak. But what the studies that I looked at found is that most people reporting on war, doing any kind of war crimes reporting, are actually the most resilient and have a higher threshold for trauma than most normal journalists. But the reason why the trauma happens is because there is this expectation on local journalists, also on some international journalists, that you report on a war, you come back to the newsroom and you have to write the story and pretend like it didn't kill your soul to see people die repeatedly. It's that disconnect between feeling your emotions, which is a normal human experience of war reporting, and the sort of false neutrality, because the reality of war crimes reporting is that it is not neutral. My job is to go into the field and find out who the victims are and who the aggressors are. I have to be objective, but not neutral. Because if I sit there and I say, yes, a war crime was committed, this is who committed it, but I'm going to be neutral, I'm not doing my job.
شكرا منيشة. أعتقد وصلنا لنهاية الجلسة.
Thank you, Manisha. I think we have reached the end of this session, which will be recorded and will be published after the conference. I encourage everyone to attend all the sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arid, and thank you so much, Mohammed.